Hello, and welcome to this edition of NonProfit World, a show that highlights nonprofit organizations and tools that can help them. Today we are very excited to have our guest, Jen Fields. Jen is a career coach and life counselor. Jen holds a master's in counseling, is a licensed professional counselor, certified professional resume writer, certified in adult experiential learning, and a number of other things that we'll have her tell you about. So without any further ado, Jen, hi, welcome.
Hi, Tom.
And would you please tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I have a number of hats that I currently wear, and not the least of which is during the day, as Clark Kent, I do my work at the American Job Center, and I help individuals who are seeking employment and training to develop their computer skills, to take online learning and certify themselves to help them advance their marketability. I also am a business owner, new business owner, and I do individual and group training and consultation on career development, career choice, and my personal passion is personality type. And I'm hoping that's what we're going to talk about today.
Well, absolutely. What do you mean by personality type, and how does it fit into, is it the professional or both
Sure.
profit, nonprofit world?
Okay. So when I was a sophomore in high school, I took a sociology class and a psychology class, and I felt like the heavens opened, the lights shone down, and I had found my niche. And so I had taken a Myers-Briggs personality type, which talks about how you manage energy, what type of information you pay attention to, how do you process that information, and then once you've processed it, what do you do? And those are the four dimensions that Myers-Briggs, which evolved from Carl Jung, looks at whenever you take this very lengthy test. Now, there's been many contributors to that sort of assessment. Carl Jung was the father of it for introversion and extroversion. Introversion means I'm very self-contained. I live in my inner world, which is not to be confused with shy. Most
Sure.
of us were labeled as shy when we were kids. But introverts tend to be very self-contained, and they like to, almost like they can explore the world for a bit, but then they like to go back inside and process everything, right? The other one is extroversion. Extroversion means I interact with the world, I get my energy from interacting with the outer world, and I continue to get vibes and jazzed up, and that's how I thrive. Sometimes extroverts have been, will tell you that I don't know what I'm thinking unless I say it out loud and I let it bounce off. It's kind of like echolocation, right? That's how we manage the energy. The second part is what information, what types of things do we pay attention to? So for example, in the studio here, if I were a detailed, sensory-oriented person, I would be paying attention to things that I can touch, see, taste, hear, and smell.
Sure.
And that would be the first thing I experience when I walk in a room. You know, I would pay attention to the way people are looking at me. I would look at their glasses, their socks, all of those sorts of things. I'm very here and now as a sensor, that's this letter, and I'm very realistic, right? So I'm telling you these to set up the conversation about how these preferences play parts in organizations, in leadership and teams.
And interesting you use the word preferences, because as I'm hearing you describe this, I'm thinking that I have elements of probably both introvert and extrovert, and I know a lot of people that have had the same.
Yes.
I
will speak to the dynamic nature of that in just a second. The next aspect, or the opposing, if you will, the other end of the spectrum from sensing, is intuition. And that's a sense of other knowingness that comes from something deeper inside one's consciousness. It bubbles up. It's inspired, as in it comes from almost a sense of not me, but then me. Big ideas, futuristic, kind of creative patterns. Intuitives tend to do that sort of focus. So you've got introverts who are inner world focused. You've got extroverts who tend to lean on outer world focus, and they generate energy and maintain energy that way. You've got sensors who are all about what I can count on right now in the real world. And you've got intuitives who are often accused of being very dreamy, you know, kind of, oh, you know, but some of our most amazing creative ideas and concepts come from the intuitive end of the spectrum. So once I've looked at those things, then I think about, do I think objectively and systematically and in a pattern? Does it have a history kind of way? And that's the thinker part. And the opposite part of that, or the other spectrum, is feeler. Feelers are subjective, feeling-based, value-based. Does it feel right to me? How does it affect other people? And so they're kind of the lightning rods for how people are doing in any environment. And hopefully what you can hear is that there's a role for each of these sort of preferences to play in an organization. The last dynamic is, now I've processed all this information in my unique way, and what do I do with it? Now, some people are very, very quick to, easy to, compelled to make a decision about something. They act. They move to action. Once they've processed it to their level of satisfaction, they're ready to make a decision. Those are like fish and cut bait folks. Let's get it done. Other folks are more on the continuum of, well, okay, let's see what else we need to consider. Well, let's talk about this more. I'm not feeling like we're at a place where we can make a decision. Now, there's psychological reasons that you can point to for all of those things. What is true is that we tend to be born with a temperament of those things, but as we go through life and we interact with our world, we refine them, and we tend to get better at some so that they become our superpower. Right? We do them so well, it's like breathing, and we're known for those things. Or we go in the opposite direction, and so those things that we don't do, we tend to actually kind of push away, and we really don't do them very well at all. Yeah. So if you're a right-handed person, this is one of the classic tests. If you pick up a pen and you write right-handed, and it goes easy and it takes no thought, and then you try to do it with your left hand, you get a feeling for what it's like to use the non-preferred way of being in the world.
Yeah.
Right.
I don't like that feeling at all.
Most people don't.
No. I'd rather write with my foot.
I'm very visual. Don't do that. So it's still yet a dynamic process. So we come into the world kind of with a wiring and a leaning for preferences, but we do tend to evolve in a way that allows us to try, in different circumstances, our alternate hand or our non-preferred areas. The people who are most successful are the ones who know what their preferences are, and then very deliberately either engage people who play to their opposite preferences and learn from them, or begin to try things out and tolerate the fact that they're not going to be as good at it as when they're using their preferred way of being in the world. So it's dynamic, but it's fixed. It grows and changes. It's also can be circumstantial.
Sure.
For example, personal story. So I'm a firstborn. I have a very gregarious mom who is a social butterfly, and yet she's very introverted when she's quiet to herself, right? She's very private. She has a very dynamic inner world. My dad is a very strong introvert, but he's a theater guy, right? So in certain circumstances, they can be very extroverted and engage in a very public way.
Sure.
I tended to be like that, but I had, as a firstborn and the child of these two people, both the wiring and the parenting, to be very extroverted most of the time. What I didn't realize was that that was actually extraordinarily draining for me, because my wiring is very introverted. And when I figured that out was after I got laid off in 2009, and I had time on my hands to catch up to myself. So it's then that I actually stopped seeing myself as an extrovert, but started to see myself as a very well-trained introvert who can extrovert at will.
Interesting way of putting that, yeah. Yeah.
So, when we're looking at dynamics, what we're looking at is how people react in different situations, knowing that they're always going to have their go-to preference. So let me ask you.
Sure.
I had promised you when we talked yesterday
Yes.
that I would try to sort you out.
I'm very excited about
as your
this,
type.
yes.
Okay, so let me just ask you a couple questions. Based on what we've already talked about, you are able to extrovert. You are a performer, and you have probably, from my experience of you, a very kind and gregarious energy, but not powerful. Like you're not, hey, how you doing? Right?
Well, no, I tend not to be in your face, yeah.
Right. So when you are busy during the day, right, what do you find get your energy up, and what do you find get your energy back to something comfortable?
Can you give me an example?
Sure. So I talked to you about jets. It's a networking environment, right? You walk into a room and it's like 50 to 70 people you don't know.
Right.
Your first response would be what? In the quiet of your mind, before you walk in, you see all these people, strangers, you don't know them, and it's a big room. What's your gut response?
My gut response is probably, now what did I do with those car keys?
Okay.
But to be honest with you, I would, having been in situations like that before, both in business and politics and elsewhere, probably find the first cup of water, and then begin a conversation with one of the people nearest to me who was not already engaged.
Right. So what that tells me is you're probably wired as an introvert, and you have mastered your own discomfort to the point where you can apply extroverted social skills for a duration of time because you see a value in that.
Sure.
Right? So let me ask you this. When you walk into that room and you see the number of people, do you get a feel for the room, the energy in the room? Do you notice the rug? Do you notice the lighting? What do you tend to focus on?
I wouldn't tend to focus on lighting and rug. What I would be doing would be to look at, see if I could identify the various personalities in the room.
Okay.
And gravitate toward individuals that I think I would be able to hold an open conversation with.
That's a very intuitive way of going about it. In other words, you're basically getting a sense not from necessarily what you see, but what you intuit, right? It could, a lot of us call it, reading a vibe, right? Getting a feel.
Sure.
And it has to do with more subtle awarenesses of patterns, cues, little mini cues. The great thing about intuition is that you're 50% right at the time.
Yeah.
Right. And those of us who do it more regularly get better at it. So we figured so far, I figure you're a gregarious introvert, but probably more on the introvert scale. You are intuitive, more on the intuitive scale, although I would say by your look, you're very sensory in terms of how you like to put yourself together. You're aware of the details of, looking good, and if I had to extrapolate, I would say probably, your house is a certain way, and you've got a nice yard and things like that. And I'm not doing that based on a stereotype. I'm just doing that off of my intuitive sense of how you perhaps prefer a certain aesthetic, right? Which is a sensory thing, but it's an intuitive sensory thing.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
It does. I love our gardens, but we've worked very hard to build our gardens using perennials, and so there was an initial pattern, but the pleasure has been over the years in watching the pattern change.
Right. Watching it change, watching them
watching it evolve.
naturalize. Yeah. I'm like that too.
Yeah.
So the third axis is thinking versus feeling. Now, thinking is analytical. It's detached. People who lead with a thinking perspective, they have plenty of feelings. They're not comfortable enough with them to use them as information in making decisions, right? They prefer a cleaner, more objective, detached, logical, linear sort of way of operating.
Sure.
A feeler, however, tends to filter through their value system, a sense of what's right, a sense of morality, a sense of ethics, a sense of felt impact on themselves and others. As you can see, they're both needed.
Yeah.
They're needed in one person, let alone in a family, a relationship, an organization. So when you would go into that room in that networking environment, and you'd kind of locate one or two people that you would want to talk about, what might be the first thing you ask the person or talk to the person about?
After introduction, what brings you here today?
And what would you want to hear after that?
A little bit of personal story as to what, I mean, in a short elevator type speech.
Yeah.
Not, you know, yeah, exactly.
Not the long.
Just
right.
you know, what type of person? Glean a little bit out of what they're saying to get some sort of an idea as to what type of person they are, what floats their boat, and what drew them to that particular event at that particular time that day.
Excellent. So that would tell me that you lean more towards the feeler's value, subjective
Yeah,
point
I
of
would
view.
say so.
Right. And again, not to suggest that you can't be analytical about things. It may not be your first go-to.
Yeah, it depends on. I guess it depends on circumstances. I mean,
Yes.
as a business, as having owned a business for 32 years,
Right.
I mean, there's an element of that where
have
it
to.
forces you to be analytical.
Right.
You know, you can't just lead with your emotion the whole time.
Correct. Correct.
That could be dangerous.
And I'll talk about the gender aspect. So, you know, Myers-Briggs studies talk about the fact that generally thinkers are male and feelers are female.
Really?
What is fascinating is, usually 75 and 75%, what is fascinating is, in general, male feelers and female thinkers are actually better prepared to operate in organizations, even though they have a harder time getting accepted for their blended abilities.
Yeah, let me ask you a question about that. That almost sounds like it's not organic. It almost sounds like that over the years that it is. Has society defined them that way, and therefore,
So they run up against
they, and I say they, we. Therefore, it's easier to be what society defines us as.
Well, so ask yourself, as a sort of feeling-based male person, when you think about your experiences growing up, teenage years or young adult years, were you sometimes in a place where you had a felt sense of a person or a relationship or something that you knew was right to experience it that way, but maybe would have been hard for you to express your awareness? A relationship,
Yeah.
or even a business
Sure.
situation,
Oh, sure.
right?
Or an employee-employer situation.
Exactly.
Certainly.
Because if you had an employee and they were telling you about their hard luck situation, but you had to hold them accountable for the performance issues that were at hand, your heart may have been very aware in a sort of merciful, you know, I get it. But as the business owner person, and that doesn't necessarily have to do with gender as much as role, you still had to hold the line and hold them accountable. So you would have a very unique experience of a compassionate sort of heart pain, knowing that in holding the line, this person may end up having to lose their job. Whereas a thinker may not have to feel that pain. They may know it's there, but they're not going to focus on that. They're going to focus on the logical analytics of the situation, because that makes sense to them. Right?
Yep.
The last axis is the decision-making and the perceptive, right? It's actually called J, or judicial, or judgmental. I don't like that term. It's too judgmental. Or perceptive.
Uh-huh.
Now, one of the fascinating things about people who are judicious is that they have a high need for control, and so they have to decide things. They're not comfortable with not being resolved about something. I'm trying to think of an example. They have a hard time waiting for Christmas Day for the presents, right? Or, you know, I can see the cake and you're telling me I can't have it until tomorrow. You know, when things are unresolved, it generates anxiety and discomfort. So they are very good at making sure things get resolved and taken care of. Sometimes they're accused of saying no too quickly and yes too late. Their opposite end of the spectrum is perceptives, people who like to perceive what else could be possible. I have had the luxury, the blessing of working with three wonderfully brilliant trainer subject matter experts, which is who I am during the day. Mm-hmm. And we all were Ps. So when you have a group of Ps, if someone doesn't J up, then things don't get done on time.
Yeah.
Because Ps are quite comfortable with sitting and processing forever.
Sure.
Right? Or we don't really log into the real time of things, especially if we're intuitive Ps, and we all were. Details, you know, you can take them or leave them. Mm-hmm. Like, there was a meme going around in Facebook recently on about the 4th of July, and Jefferson was, oh crap, is that due tomorrow? Right?
Yes.
Implying that he was a P, someone
Exactly.
who really wasn't logged into time, date, and due date.
Sure.
And was okay with, all right, well, we maybe need to work on this a little
Yeah.
bit more. So what's crazy about Ps and Js is they often marry, or they often find themselves working together on a team, and they drive each other insane.
Let me ask you a quick question. You defined J's as
Judicious.
judicious. What are P's?
Perceptive.
Perceptive. Gotcha.
Right.
Okay.
So, are you comfortable with things being open-ended and looking at options, more so than having to resolve and get a decision and something final? Or are you someone who really has a checklist kind of almost every day in your mind, and you know, there's a pressure to get it done?
I wouldn't say the pressure, but I'm one that started every day of my professional life with a list with a to-do list, mm-hmm. and would be very happy to be checking off those individual to-do lists. But If I started with 10, by the end of the day, I usually ended up with 25.
You're a P, my friend.
Yeah. So
You're
a number of things certainly would get done because they
Sure.
needed to.
Right. Right.
You know, the contract had to be written at that particular
Right.
time. But other things, if they took a little bit longer, well,
Right.
that's all right too.
And the good news is Ps can be Js, because especially if they're intuitive and they have a mission, right? They know they have to get stuff done.
Right.
So they can actually J up pretty well. Js have a little bit harder time with Ps, but if you assure someone who's a judicious person that by considering some of these other options, they will have a better, more effective decision, then they can be on board with it.
Would it be then Ps, the perceptives, they would be more comfortable with, to use another P, prioritizing?
A J wants to make sure that things are organized, so that would be a very J suggestion, is prioritization. And yes, it is a really useful tool for Ps, but that's details. Mm-hmm. So depending on whether they're an intuitive or a sensor, if they're a sensor, then prioritizing makes perfect sense, because then it's like, let me just knock these details down and I'll take care of it. So again, we may have a preference, a temperament that we play off of. We have a leaning towards. Nothing is written in stone, but we do have something that kind of consistently guides us, almost like an inner gyroscope, most of the time.
Sure.
And as we go through life, usually midlife, we tend to be faced with either the opportunity to start expanding our skill set into our non-preferred areas, or our psyche forces us to deal with that.
Sure.
Things happen. So
now, how does, having gone through this, it's fascinating. We got to talk more about this. Have you seen in your experiences? Have you seen certain patterns in what personality types are more prevalent among the for-profit, quote-unquote, business world, entrepreneurs, versus the nonprofit? Or not versus, as opposed to
right.
the nonprofit leadership?
So I was raised professionally in nonprofit, and they're state-funded nonprofit community mental health agencies. So that's where my first 21 years of my career was spent. So I was very familiar with visionary leaders who had to deal with a board, who had to fundraise and grant write, who had to make sure they hired people who could manage folks who were usually also kind of intuitive, kind of idealistic. Sometimes sensing and feeling go together. Like you'll find people in the healthcare professions sensing feelers. They tend to be the folks that nurse and to care for.
Sure.
What's interesting is the shift in nonprofit to really documenting every possible thing, which is detail-oriented, demands for a detail-oriented person to have both interpersonal feeling skills, oftentimes intuitive, but then turn around and deal with a computer where you got to enter everything. Ironically, the folks who are best at entering the data and tracking that are the introverts, because they can maintain great focus. The leaders of a nonprofit tend to have to be really good connectors, and those are extroverts.
Sure.
In the for-profit world, you've got folks. Again, I don't want to say that there's either or, because you have all types in leadership positions. For-profit leaders are usually much more comfortable with authority, which means they may not, unless they're servant leaders, they may not have a dependency on their feeling sense, but their analytical sense is always keeping in mind what actions need to occur to keep the profit business going and marching to the bottom line.
You just used a phrase, servant leader. Talk to me a little bit more about that. What do you mean by that?
So Robert Greenleaf, about 20 years ago, I believe he is a British personality type kind of guy, and he does a lot of work about leadership. He came up with the idea that you need to, if you're going to be a servant leader, you're going to be driven to make sure that you put others, including your organization, ahead of your own needs.
I see.
So you're looking to make sure that, because when you do that, the people who get the business of the business done are supported. They may be more inclined to use their superpowers, which are their personality strengths. And ultimately, when people are lifted up because they're supported and listened to and trusted to have what it takes to contribute to the organizational mission and goal, a servant leader encourages that to happen, because they're not about controlling and power so much as they are using their power to engage others in using their own power.
So it's a much more collaborative environment.
In a sense,
I mean,
yes.
It may be that I mean, certainly at some point in time, somebody has to make a decision about something.
Well,
but if
yes.
the person is smart enough to bring in, to be able to know the strengths and weaknesses of the individuals that he or she is bringing into that organization, be it profit or nonprofit, and then be smart enough to let go,
right,
and let these people be themselves.
Right.
Then that's the type of collaboration you're talking about, and therefore
Yes.
being a servant leader. I understand.
Exactly. And so in terms of personality type, there's a model called the zigzag model of decision making. And what that does is it actually organizes 4 of the preferences. If you start with, let's say you have a project or something you need to accomplish. You want to use a sensing function to establish what are the facts, what are the details, what are the realities here and now. So that's the S. Then you go over to the intuitive. That's the N. And that is, okay, now that I have that stuff, where do I want this to go? What is the vision? Like how do I see this growing and changing? And what might be the future impact of it? Then you go down to, let's see, S and T. T for thinking, analytical. So now that you've got all the facts that you may need about your decision, you've got your sense of creative growth and what's the future impact or pattern, then you've got to analyze. You analyze pros and cons, logically what makes the most sense. You're including your sense of what's gone before, you know, in terms of your decision making. When you lean this way, how does that usually work out? So it's a detached, non-emotional way of analyzing your information. And then you zip over to the F, which is, okay, so now what is the actual felt sense for me? Do I get a sense of rightness if I make this decision going this way? Does it align with my values? Will it impact people in a way that I can live with or that I value? Right? So you have the, let's see if I'm over here. So you have the sensing, then the intuitive, then the thinking, and then the feeling. And that's for an individual to make a decision. If a leader does that, then the leader can build teams and know who to tap when they've got a project or a goal.
Sure.
And really start to focus on, all right, who are my best sensors? I'm going to have them go out and gather the realistic data.
Identifying them either out of the organization staff,
Right.
or even or certainly through the board membership.
Through the board membership, right. There's an interesting aspect of boards that I was learning about, in that the one element board members have in common is a passion for that mission. And maybe a second element is, I want to make an impact. After that, people come at that mission in a variety of different ways. And so the whole idea of increasing board, and because they come at it from different ways, and they're volunteer, and they're usually pretty sure that their way is right, each individual board member, they can slow down the deliberation process to make decisions. And so if a CEO of an organization, a nonprofit, has the servant mindset and the self-awareness to teach the board a decision-making sort of zigzag format, then they can begin to identify who the strengths are and where they fit in the process.
Sure.
So it's an option for a leader to actually learn how to do it with their organization, but also with their board. And it can help alleviate a lot of the pace issue for making things move faster.
Is that this whole process that you're discussing, is this something that you have seen evolve and get stronger over the years?
I can't say that. I don't know. I have to tell you, I've been trying to talk type to the organizations I've worked for a while. I also haven't really, so we figured out you are an introverted, intuitive, feeling, perceptive, right?
All right.
I am also that same type.
I knew we were going to get along.
And when you said something that kind of sealed the deal for me, when you talked about being a late bloomer in terms of your theatrical artwork. INFPs tend to be late bloomers. We're like a fine wine, and we mature slowly, but when we get there, we're amazing. So I haven't really come into my own fruition as someone to speak about type or present or, speak. I've always had the intellect to do it, but not the integration of it and the confidence. And so I haven't actually been here long enough with the organizations that I work with, or had even board participation in a way that I could convey that. Where I do my most damage, my best work, is when I'm talking to job seekers about how to honor, to discover what their superpowers are, what their strengths are, using personality type, the Myers-Briggs version. I do a shortened type version, and then helping them to formulate a self-concept that honors their strengths, because when you've been laid off, it's usually fairly devastating, and you start to kind of deconstruct who you are. This helps as I said, put Humpty Dumpty back together, but then it helps them build a brand. They can actually come up with a superpower statement. My superpower statement is word wizard, weaving career magic, something like that. So, and I haven't looked at it in a while. But to answer your question, I think there are plenty of organizations out there that have a concept where it's strength-based leadership. Whether they're using the zigzag decision-making model of type, I don't know. There's other personality type venues out there. So even though Myers-Briggs has been around for quite a number of years and it's very well studied and whatnot, there are people who say, yeah, but it's not as proven as one thinks. So
yeah, and Google I think has another, and I know that I'm certain that there are other tools.
Yeah, there are.
But they're all designed to do the same work.
Yeah, I have a list of leadership attributes. And what I thought I would do, if there was time, is just go through them and talk about which preferences would actually support those attributes.
Sure. Yeah, I'm sure we have time.
Okay, so Google is amazing. It is the oracle. I love Google. And so I looked up an article by the Moran Company, a guy named Bill Moran, who is a nonprofit executive search company that he owns. And so he named 12 attributes. And so what I thought I would do is I would name the attribute, and then I would talk about which preference supports that attribute the best. Hopefully to point out the fact that nonprofit leaders come in all shapes and sizes.
Exactly.
The question is, if you've got the strength there, the preference, you're going to have something, you're going to not have something else. And do you have the wisdom and the wherewithal to tap into that and allow that to be in somebody else?
Sure.
So, for example, self-starter, right? A self-starter is someone who's a doer, someone who directs goal-driven purposes and actions, right? Self-starters are people who really don't need to be told what to do. So you'll find that extroverts are very attuned to doing what makes sense to them out in the world. And judicious people are all about getting it done. So the combination of extroversion and judiciousness tends to help support that idea of a self-starter.
Makes sense.
Okay? I'm not going to read all of them, but just a couple.
Of course.
Passion for the organization's mission. Now, if you're in a nonprofit position, you better have passion. It doesn't matter what your preferences are, because nonprofit is also at times a vow of poverty, right? So if you have the idea of having a luxury mansion and all of that, you're not going to do that off of a nonprofit existence.
Odds are pretty good that's right.
Most people are in it because they have a sense of value, a sense of meaningfulness, a sense of wanting to lift the world somehow. So an intuitive who has that visionary sort of idea is the person that someone who uses an intuition can see the vision and can see it actually coming into reality. A feeler is someone who obviously cares about the impact of the world on people and people on the world and whatever the organization's actions are. So an intuitive feeler element adds to the whole passion, but really anyone can be passionate about the actual mission. A couple others. My favorite, besides my own type, is the person who handles financial acumen, right, and the details of performance. Those folks need to have deep focus, right, so that's an introvert. They need to be able to handle the details, so that's a sensor. When you're handling details in deep focus, things that actually are structurally supporting the moving forward of the organization, a thinker tends to be better at that. But a thinker, if they only consider the logistics of something, the objective analytics of something, they're going to be short-sighted because you have to get those somethings done through people. So you need a feeler too. But the last one, of course, is judicious. Let's get this stuff done. When you want to expand or analyze, problem solve, because your financials aren't turning out to be what they should be, then you want to bring a P in, a perceptive person, someone who leans in that direction. But when it comes to making those decisions and execution, you want your judicious person to be doing that.
I would think that those attributes are unfortunately here in Connecticut, but probably all over, with the financial strains that are being put on our nonprofit organizations because of the financial strains that the state is in. You know, if you build a budget in January or whenever your fiscal year begins, and you find out halfway through the year that grant that you were expecting isn't going to show up,
Right.
you've got to be perceptive enough to be able to plug that hole.
Exactly. And it does take those attributes. It takes the creativity and the responsiveness. One other. Let's see. Ability to listen.
I'm sorry, what?
Good thing I wasn't drinking the water. The ability to listen requires that you calm yourself and quiet yourself long enough to make space so someone can actually get their ideas out to you. So an introvert tends to be able to do that better than an extrovert. In fact, an introvert-extrovert conversation dynamic, I've watched this 1,000 times. When someone would go to this JETS networking session, if they were the introvert, and let's say I'm the introvert and you're the extrovert, I go, hi, my name's Jen. How are you? And I don't need to say anything else, because as the extrovert, you're going to fill the time.
That's right.
And so when I train people and advise people how to balance their type, I talk about, for example, with extroverts, the rule of threes. You're only allowed 3 statements, and then you have to ask 3 questions. And the introvert, the flip side of that is, okay, you can ask 3 questions, which takes the spotlight off of you, but then you have to offer up 3 statements about you, because it engages somebody in doing something a little bit not comfortable, not familiar, not preferred. Sure. But it helps stretch. You asked me earlier, how do I stretch into my non-preferred areas? Little simple tweaks, right? Because that's never going to be your preferred area. But the question is, can you get into it for that moment you're visiting that foreign place long enough to be somewhat effective, and thereby extending your effectiveness across contexts and situations. So one last one, fundraising skills, big one for nonprofits, right?
Big one.
They have the knowledge and experience in fundraising techniques, including major gift fundraising. So I would want my fundraising person to lead with extroversion, right? Glad handing, how you doing? I love connecting to people. They are master connectors. So I want that person to lead with that. In order for me to get people to invest in my organization and what we do, I also want that person to have a felt sense of what someone needs and wants, and what, so a social intelligence about that. So that person hopefully will also be a feeler to me, or at least have some decent feeling preferences. Sensing means I'm going to pay attention to the details that I notice about you so that I can speak to them. So there's a little bit of sales going on there.
Absolutely.
Right? But a feeler is often very genuine. They're not, they tend to be very authentic. So I'm not going to be a slick willy salesman if I'm an ESF person working for a nonprofit. It's just not going to work. Well,
sure. I mean, you have to be, if there are 2 people that are going to give to a nonprofit, it is incumbent upon the organization and the individual who's responsible for that, I would think, to understand what their motivations are. And if there are 2 people, or if there are 10 people, there can be 2 or 10 completely different motivations.
Right.
There could be a motivation because the individual has had a member of the family that has been touched by the mission, by that which the mission of the organization is trying to. Another individual could just simply be looking for, in its basest form, a tax write-off. Right. But it's those motivations that will not only in effect close the deal, but will set the foundation for fostering the further relationship that needs to develop long term.
Right. So let me do an example. So let's say you're trying to engage an organization in having you be one of their fundraisers, right? And you've been a business owner, you've got plenty of engagement skills, you're a feeler, so you can really get at what is a felt sense of value for the person. If you were judicious, someone who needed to hurry up and make a decision, because there's a compulsory nature sometimes to that, it would not play to your best ability for the nonprofit if you don't take the time, as a perceptive person would, to really see all the options with that individual or that group of people.
Sure.
Right? You were just speaking about different contexts in which someone might be thinking, oh, I want to give money to this organization for any one of these reasons.
Right.
A perceptive person, which you are, would really not only be able to hang with the waiting for the answer, but you would encourage time to take the time to get to know each of those people, because you love options.
Sure.
Right? So an INFP could actually be a very good fundraiser, because you use your intuitive sense of people, you have a felt sense of what impacts them, you love options, so you're really interested in how many different ways you can get at what they're really interested in. And as an introvert, you're deep focusers, so you actually will listen more. Now, I did say a minute ago an extrovert would be a great lead. If the extrovert is self-aware and they can, long enough, after they've initiated the conversation, that's great. If not, then they're going to lose the person. An introvert who doesn't unbutton and ask at least 3 questions, that person's not going to get the relationship going. So you see that there's developmental sort of things that we have to do to mitigate and moderate our preference in different circumstances. But if I were a nonprofit organization, I would definitely want someone who can both engage but listen deeply. I would want someone who can imagine ways, multiple ways to engage the person. I would want to be able to have a felt sense of their values, so that I can speak to how our organization and its activities will honor that value and that mission. And then as a perceptive person, if my take doesn't work, I'm going to work to find another alternative way.
Sure.
So.
Sure.
Let's see. So there was a question, I think, about comparing and contrasting for-profit and nonprofit leadership. We didn't answer that, right?
No, we didn't.
Okay. So one of the things, well, what would you say as a for-profit leader should be some guiding, what are some guiding attributes as a leader in a for-profit environment? What do you, just guess, it's really not.
Well,
When you were.
Yeah, I mean, certainly organizational aspects. I was in sales marketing, so you certainly had to be able to set your objectives for your business year, and have measurements along the way. Be able to be analytical enough to have measurements along the way to see how you were doing. Right. Be flexible enough to be able to make whatever adjustments midstream, mid-course needed to be made to reach or exceed the objectives that you would set. Yep. The prior year. And obviously in those cases we're talking about profits, we're talking about dollars and cents. Right. We're talking about sales. You know, not a mission per se. I mean, it's a lot easier when you believe in the product that you're selling. Yes, absolutely. But that's not really the most important thing. Right. Right. And so one of the contrasting differences, and if you were a for-profit professional trying to join a nonprofit organization, is that dollars and cents are in fact the focal point, making more or maintaining what you've got. Right. Humans tend to be the mission of the nonprofits, and there's almost a sort of self-righteous zeal about that. You know, you can't count humans. You can't quantify growth or, you know, movement on the scale of quality of life or whatever the focal point of the mission is for a nonprofit. And yet,
because of financial realities, nonprofits have to be better at quantifying active performance of their staff, their programs, and showing points of measurement and resolution, and even predictability on return of investment for their boards.
Exactly.
So there is a place for for-profit leaders in nonprofit organizations. They have to be mindful, though, that they're dealing with a different animal. And the animal has attributes like they tend to be more democratic in the way they operate, or more traditional in terms of, well, this is the way we've always done it. So it doesn't necessarily lend itself to the flexibility that a for-profit needs. For-profit needs to be agile.
Exactly.
Right.
Innovative.
But now nonprofits also need to be, because the money, they have to chase the money.
Sure.
Right? And with our economic times being what they are, and the differences in where the money goes, a for-profit leader tends to have that added secret sauce that can help. But if they don't approach the nonprofit environment in a way that shows that it's humans first, or we're all about the mission, then they're not going to get let in.
Yeah.
They're just not. It's important you can scream all you want about how you can help them, but if you haven't been invited in, it's not going to work. You've had that experience.
Exactly.
Kind of. Yeah.
Exactly. In all sorts of different ways. But yeah, and the mesh can happen. I mean, well, hopefully the mesh will happen. But another example is, it has been sort of traditional for a nonprofit to on a financial side of things, to say, well, just pull a number out of the air, 90 cents out of every dollar that we use goes toward the mission.
Right.
And forget about the possibility that, well, if 85 cents went toward the mission, and you put 5 cents more toward community outreach, if you want to call it that, or marketing, which is what a business person would call it, then what does that extra 5 cents get you in terms of return? How many more meals are you going to be able to provide to families that need them? Right. How many more books are you going to be able to provide to kids that need them?
Right. What's the long game?
Exactly. That's exactly right. There's a paradigm shift, hopefully.
It is a paradigm shift, and I do believe nonprofits are having to make it kicking and screaming, and some are embracing it. One of the interesting aspects of nonprofit leadership is that, depending on the individual, there's a certain amount of humility in the leadership role. I'm doing God's work. This is a mission.
Right.
It's really meant, it's not about me, it's about uplifting, humanity. Well, and this is what I tell people who are introverted. It's not bragging if it's true. And if you don't actually tell people out loud, say it out loud, not just in your head, but say it out loud, what it is you do well, then you're going to get glossed over. No one's going to pay attention to you. When I was an unemployed person, I took the Myers-Briggs test at the Department of Labor. It was a 2-day adventure, and so the test is very long. On the second day, we got our results back, and we did some exercises. 75% of the people in the room were introverts.
Is that true?
In 2009. And then as a reemployment coach, where I was teaching professionals how to get back to work, consistently 75% of the people in the room were introverts. Why do you think that was?
Wow.
Because we assume that our good work speaks for itself, right? But in a communal environment like an organization, the noisy bird gets the worm, right? The one that says, hey, see what I did here? Right, so I would talk to them about, when you do something you're pretty impressed with, or when you achieve something, or you don't have to be loud about it. Just send an update email to your supervisor. By the way, got this done today. This is the impact I expect it will have. Let me know if there's anything else I can do.
Sure.
It is the introverted way of bragging. So leadership for nonprofits has to actually start making sure that it communicates, markets its achievements more voraciously, like a nonprofit, to its board and to its stakeholders and to the community at large.
Sure.
They don't have any problem getting customers and clients. It's the people that will invest money and time that they need to market to.
So, what would you say to let's say an executive director and a board invited you in to visit with them, and you've got a minute. What would be
not my forte?
What would be the most important thing that you would suggest to them in beginning the process of reviewing doing a little self profile?
Okay. Find out what you do well. Find out who your strongest players are doing it. Make sure they get some recognition in the process. Figure out who to market that to. Figure out who to tell and how many different ways to tell it. Use social media. Use the digital world. Tap into the strengths of the people that are not in leadership positions, because they're the ones that are making it happen, and they have a lot more leadership mindset than you give them credit for, usually. And again, that's strength-based. So I would say if you're looking to expand your impact as a nonprofit organization, look at who you already have. You may not need to do programs differently, but you may need to support and engage the staff differently and the board members.
And perhaps look for even other nonprofit organizations that you can build relationships with.
Absolutely.
To help further the message of both.
The zigzag.
Well, we've had an enjoyable conversation. This has been wonderful. Thank you so much, Jen. I really appreciate it, and thank you so much for coming and being part of the broadcast for the nonprofit world.
Love it. Had so much fun.
Great. Thank you
Tom.
very much. Thank you very much, folks.